Dr. Christopher Sellers is a professor of history at Stony Brook University and the director of the Center for the Study of Inequality and Social Justice. He received his PhD at Yale University and his MD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill Medical School. His research concentrates on the history of environment and health, of cities and industries, and of inequality and democracy, with a focus on the United States and Mexico. Among his numerous grants, fellowships, and awards are those from the National Science Foundation, the National Humanities Center, and the National Library of Medicine. Dr. Sellers began his career studying the environment and health histories of industrialization and of institutional bulwarks such as medicine and the corporation, which led to works such as Hazards of the Job in 1997, The Nature of the Firm in 99, and Landscapes of Exposure in 2003. He then studied the ties between suburbanization and those experiences, movements, expertise, and politics characterized as environmental, resulting in Crabgrass Crucible and a forthcoming book on Atlanta, which also steps back to ask questions about inequality and democracy. At the Wilson Center in 2016-2017, he wrote his latest work, Toxic Crossings, an in-depth comparative and transnational study of the history of industrial hazards in Mexico and the United States from the 20th into the 21st century. He led the founding of the History of Environment and Health Network and Enviro Health. Help me welcome Dr. Christopher Sellers.
Thanks for that nice introduction. I hardly remember I did all that. So I'm coming to you today as in my guise as an historian, and my charge is to speak on historiography as it pertains to structural racism. And I think historiography for us historians means some boring things, but I want to focus on what I think is most relevant for us today. Okay. It refers to those versions of the past that we Long Islanders have long told ourselves, starting with our assumptions about just who this we is and just whose past count as our own. Histories centered exclusively around the experiences of white Americans, and elite whites at that, have long gotten in the way of our recognizing exactly how unjust our country's history has been, all the discrimination that it's involved. Today I want to take you, there's another layer too, and it's the stories that we tell about that history, the myths of history that we purport through which we purport to explain the past to ourselves. I want to take a little bit of that on today. Through a quick trip in Long Island history, I want to look at the limitations of this mythical history, but also suggest how another perspective on history, guided by the values of inclusion and justice, can help point the way to building this movement for more just Long Island. Now, my colleague Abena Asari did the historiography talk at Stony Brook, and I think she opened with a great point, and so I want to echo that here. These questions about creating a more just past as well as present for Long Island, they're not just abstract or academic, they're personal. As she put it, they require we bring our whole selves into the room. Well, let me just put myself forward here. You may have detected I don't have a Long Island accent. I actually grew up in the South. And my sort of wrestling with that heritage is I think a lot of what made me an historian. deciding to make that my professional livelihood. Now, I've lived on Long Island for over a quarter of a century, and I've delved pretty deeply into its 20th century history in particular. And in the process, one of the chief myths I found pervading popular understanding of Long Island's past is that true racism happened in other parts of the U.S., just not here. Aha, yeah. I think we're sort of, as historians, we've been unpacking this for a while, but I think there's a lot more work to do, as I hope we can talk about a little bit further today. You know, it's just not true that America's original sin, as some have put it, slavery, that it was just a product of the American South. Slavery was here, and that, I mean, I have a little bit of trouble with that whole original sin idea. It sounds like, you know, something we can't get rid of. But one other piece of trouble I have with it is that, well, the Native Americans might have something else to say about that. Original sin. Well, look at what happened here. There's some nice maps that really graphically illustrate what happened over those 150 years between the English arrival on Long Island and English settlement and colonization, basically the conquering of Long Island. And by 1744, you can see Native American tribes are pushed into enclaves that are many of them where their reservations, that reservation system that is the modern way of confining Native Americans, is being born at this early moment. One other problem with this notion of slavery as America's original sin is just who did the sinning. Not the slaves themselves, I suspect. They were more the sinned against. Next slide. Well-intentioned as as those making this kind of declaration are, they also tacitly leave out the slaves themselves from their working notion of America, but what America is and includes. Nor was slavery as confined as so many as are taught to the cotton plantations of the South. Long Island's early economy was also built in part off slave labor. So any of you have been out to Shelter Island and seen this Sylvester historical site? Looks like I see some heads nodding, yeah. Well, from the moment he bought land from the Montaukets to start this, not a plantation, but a large farm, this was in the mid-1600s, he set about shipping slaves from Barbados, where he had a big sugar plantation, here, or in this case, to Shelter Island. And that was just the beginning of the slave economy on Long Island. It's kind of astounding that by the time of the American Revolution, the black share of this small population of Long Islanders, it was actually approaching what it would become later on after World War II through suburbanization. And Brooklyn was like a third black. Most of those blacks, of course, were enslaved. This gets me to the kind of this whirlwind tour, the 20th century history, 20th and 21st century history of this, what we can think of as the original or preeminent sin of modern Long Island history. I would say that's housing discrimination. Well, there are other variants as well. Long Island certainly had its share of this more spectacular and public kind of racism, as represented by the Klan. Here they are in Stony Brook marching through the streets, and even a Nazi enclave out in Hauppauge. This is from 1939, before the Second World War. But arguably more influential over the longer term was how, as Long Island transformed from an agricultural to a fundamentally residential landscape, racial line drawing and exclusion shaped the very pattern by which houses were built and sold and neighborhoods created. The racial restrictive covenant was the first tool used. Higher-end builders and their customers very clearly and quite legally at this point discriminated on the basis not just of skin color but religion against Jews and Catholics. Starting even before that tool itself, and so this is a housing development, Strathmore Manhasset, that was developed actually by a Jewish developer, Abraham Levitt, but it was also a development whose restrictive covenant disabled him and his sons from buying into it because it didn't allow any Jews. So starting even before that tool itself, a host of other institutions crowded in to do this work, federal and local governments, realtors also, fashioning new ways of confining huge slices of the suburban housing markets only to whites, and whites of the right religion at that. Next. So Levittown, the iconic development everybody knows about that made Long Island into a sort of a national ground zero for suburbia. It offers an excellent case in point. In 1950, when this African-American couple, Eugene and Bernice Burnett, went home shopping there, they were sent away by the realtor. They were the only black people in sight, they realized. So they're kind of embarrassed by that to begin with. But then the realtor told them, oh, it's not me. It's the owners and builders of this development. They've decided not yet to sell to Negroes. These builders themselves, Levitt and Sons, they vocally dragged their heels for many years after this as well, and into the 1960s, they combated rising efforts by the federal government to actually open up their new developments to those who were not white. Well, let me leave you with a word of caution about the uses of this kind of story as well. This story about the Burnetts has been in Newsday repeatedly, most recently in sort of introducing this series of forums. Now, we certainly need to pay attention to these episodes of exclusion, but by dropping the Burnett story right there after the realtor kicks them out of the shop, we still maintain this illusion that Long Island's suburbanizing story was only about whites. A Long Island history grounding this push for a more just Long Island shouldn't just stop there. Once you do follow the Burnetts, you finally find that they actually became suburban homeowners anyway in a development called Roanoke Park in North Amityville. And there's actually a black history of Long Island suburbanizing over the same period that is as crucial to understanding this past as is our textbook version that focuses just on white suburbia. And in fact, you can see it's kind of hard, not very large, but actually the proportional gain of blacks in Suffolk County in this very period, of 1940 to 1960, actually surpassed that of whites. And of course, that's where the Burnetts moved to, Suffolk County and North Amityville. Other highlights, civil rights movement in New York State was in important part based in Long Island. And some of the big leaders in the 1960s included Eugene Burnett, learning from his Levittown experience, and also this fellow dentist, Eugene Reed, who was elected the president of the state chapter and had a lot of was very involved in the national NAACP politics as well. So you can see, however, that this last slide shows just how much more confined blacks were as compared to whites by this time. This is 1974, and if you look at the map today, like the map Elaine showed, a lot of these places are still the places that African Americans live on Long Island more exclusively. So this pattern is held. It even goes back to the 1920s even. To set our sights on building a Long Island that is truly more just, we all need to set aside our inherited illusions that the history of this place was all or even mostly about whites. And let me be clear, that we includes not just those most targeted and wounded by racism and its structural legacy, but the rest of us, whose comfort and frequent indifference have come an important part at their expense. Thank you.